So in 1986, I found out about the research of Dr. Kenneth Blum using amino acid concentrates to turn off cravings for alcohol and drugs, and later his remarkable study with 250 post-optifasters who were food addicted. And since then, we have seen over 5,000 people. And almost all of them have been food addicts. They may also have been alcohol addicts, cannabis addicts. I'm called the pot lady in Northern California because I started the first program for adolescent addicts in Northern California. And we knew that, those of us in the adult addiction field, we knew there was a problem with kids, but we didn't know what it was. And I had taken the job as director of this program on the condition that I could start hiring holistic nutritionists. Nobody knew if it would help, but I was sure it would. I also asked if it said another condition was that I start working with kids. I just had a passion for working with kids. But again, I didn't know what I was really proposing. And when I started working with kids, it was immediately apparent that cannabis was the problem. It takes a long time, average 15 years, for an alcoholic to become an alcoholic if they only use alcohol. But with cannabis, we were getting, in a year, these little kids, 15, would be completely transformed into full-bore drug addicts. They were stealing to get the money to buy the weed, and their parents were wondering what happened to my adorable child 2 years ago. And from age 0 to 13, he was, adorable and loving and caring and had a lot of interests, and all of a sudden there's nothing interesting except skateboarding and smoking weed. I don't want to get off on that too far. But cannabis has become a tremendously potent drug, highly addictive, tremendously brain active. It's THC content, of course. Highly specialized. We have the weed that impacts the, the mellowing part of the brain, and the weed that impacts the stimulant part of the brain. And people know what they come by different names, and they have different prices, and people can pick and choose which part of the brain they're going to target. Actually, I talked to you a little bit about trialing and how we found out that if we trial these brain-targeted nutrients in the office with people, we get their effects almost immediately, within 3 to 5 minutes. And I'm going to use one of the client that actually prompted us to start trialing. Prior to that, we knew that these things worked, and we sent them home with them, and they figured it out for themselves, basically. Or they came back and said, it's not doing much yet, and so we doubled the dose or whatever. But this young man, he was 27 years old. He was a Native American, pure blood, from Northern California tribe. He was brought up by his grandmother, who dug tule bulbs and fed him tule bulbs and made acorn squash, processed the acorns and made gruel, and fished for salmon for him. And their tribe is near a big lake in Lake County, California. And the head of the counseling department at Indian Health Services there was about to resign because of the lack of success. They had 80% addiction rates, and they had fabulous long-term programs funded and specifically for Native Americans, beautiful programs. But they never made it past 3 days home before they were using again. And this is in spite of the fact that the tribal clinic was, devoted, and they were skilled counselors and so forth, but they ran into the same brick wall that I had run into. Counseling doesn't help people with brain damage. So she heard about me on the radio when she was about to drive over to the next county to get her supervision for the week, and she was going to resign that day. And she heard about me on the radio and said, wait a minute, maybe this would work. And so she called me and we talked, and she said, can I come with one of the other counselors and one of our clients, and you could interview and whatever you do, and we could learn how to do it, and we'll film it. And it was a very exciting proposition for us. One of my staff members was 25% Native American. I think Cherokee, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so he came on. This young man came with the counselors, and one of the counselors was running the video machine, and the other one was just watching, and we were all talking, except that it turned out that he was so depressed. This is a meth addict, and any meth addict or any stimulant addict is going to be terribly exhausted and depressed for a long, long time after they stop using the stimulant, because their brain has gone on empty. It was relying on the stimulant, and it takes a long time and a good diet, which they almost never eat, in order to repair the brain so that it can generate some energy for them. So it turned out that he was so depressed in his recovery. He'd been back from the treatment program for about 2 days. They wanted to get him before he relapsed, but he was too depressed to talk. So my assessment fell flat on its face. So I proposed that I show him a chart that described what you're going to see here, what the symptoms of someone who was deficient in each of these 5 parts of the brain, how the person who was deficient in those 5 different brain chemicals felt. And would he be able to point at the symptoms that he had and maybe give some kind of an indication, about how severe his symptoms were. I'll tell you the story brain site by brain site in a minute. I'm just going to tell you now that from that day forward, we have been doing trialing every single day. We've done 20,000 trials, at least, so that our knowledge about the amino acids, what they do, what are the symptoms they turn on, what are the symptoms they turn off, is exquisite now. And we do this assessment, the symptom assessment that I describe in detail in the Craving Cure, with everyone every week. And we have them do it at home so that they can see their symptom numbers coming down. And if there's one area where the symptom numbers aren't coming down, then they take some more of that nutrient. And then we see the symptoms start coming down. I've trained hundreds of people since, I've been training people for a long time, but in a concerted way since 2004. And all of them have the same experience. And they come from different specialties. For example, one of them has been getting her nutritional certification, but her career has been in physical therapy. She's actually a respiratory therapist, but she works with physical therapists in a rehab clinic that's part of a hospital, and they do a lot of stroke cases. And she wanted to work with people, anybody, but she only had stroke victims to work with. So she picked one. And this was somebody who was about to be thrown out of the program. He was 75 years old. He had had a stroke. He was coming in for physical therapy. He was doing nothing. He was not cooperating. He wasn't practicing at home. He was so depressed that he was no longer talking to his wife. She would take him to the store. He wouldn't get out of the car. He was using a walker, but he could use it, but he wouldn't. He wasn't eating well or much. So they said, well, we can't keep taking money from the insurance company when what we're doing isn't working and you're not doing it, and they were kind of mad at him. But she said, before we cut him loose, could I have at him, they've been hearing about the amino acids and how excited she was, and it's an area of California that's sort of liberal, and the head doctor said, okay, fine. In fact, all doctors except one that we've ever worked with have said the following, word for word. Well, it's probably not going to do anything for you, but it can't hurt. They say that word for word. They have been trained that if a patient approaches you and wants to be on a supplement or wants to make dietary changes, you say this particular formula. And we love hearing that formula because it gives us the open door. Really, even if they're on antidepressants, they don't know any better than to say that. When antidepressants, you have to be careful. There's a whole, protocol that you go through. But back to our young man. This is not his brain, but this is the brain of someone who was equally impaired with both depression and carb addiction. I mean, she was literally in bed eating candy day and night. She was a former attorney, husband a psychiatrist, who had grown up in South Africa and got interested in the native use of herbs for mood problems and had continued to be interested in that. So he tried everything he knew. And he was a colleague of Daniel Amen. Are you familiar with Daniel Amen and his brain work? Well, he worked in the clinic with Daniel Amen, and so he brought his wife in, and Daniel Amen took a brain picture and said, this is very serious. The brain is supposed to be all blue. If there's abnormality, it'll show up in white and red. You can see how much abnormality in various areas of the brain. But most of them are in this archway at the top called the cingulate. And this is an area of the brain where a great deal of serotonin is made, our natural antidepressant, one of our natural appetite regulators. She didn't sleep well either, and whoops. What happened? So he said, you've already tried antidepressants that work in that area of the brain, so I don't know what else to suggest to you. But since you crave carbohydrates, why don't you go see Julia Ross? She probably can't help you with your mood, but hey, she might be able to at least stop the cravings. So she and her husband came to visit me, our clinic, and they were perfectly happy to try anything. And they did. And she started taking the amino acid tryptophan, which is one of the two direct foods required for the brain to produce serotonin. And 3 months later, Daniel Amen took her brain picture again. Yeah. So you can imagine how much fun we have in our clinic. Irritability is another symptom of serotonin deficiency, and so it was everybody's pleasure to see her much happier, including ours. We get irritable clients, but she was a joy. As a matter of fact, NBC in her area did a special on her about amino acid recovery for depression. And they showed her running with her dog and making jewelry. And but this is typical. In fact, Sam, the Native American who came to us, experienced the same thing the day that he came in. So we couldn't give him the questionnaire, but the questionnaire is the key to the miracle. The questionnaire is a 5-part instrument which lists in each part the deficiency symptoms for that particular neurotransmitter. For example, in the section on low serotonin, it would say depressed, negative, irritable, obsessive, fearful, worried. There's a very long list of deficiency symptoms for serotonin. And we also have a 1 to 10 scale, a 0 to 10 scale, so that we can really see how severe is it when they come in. The next week, we have them give us the symptoms again, and we see the change immediately, even if we haven't seen a change in the trial, which is very unusual. So each one of these symptoms comes from the neuroscience research. They know what a brain that is carrying optimal serotonin looks like. What are the symptoms of the people? And if they get someone who's more serotonin deficient, and they did at that time do blood testing to verify, and cerebrospinal fluid testing, to verify what is somebody with low serotonin like. And they established these scales. And so we have not found them to fail. This questionnaire is the most useful thing I know in all the work that I've done in all these years. And those of you who are on the internet may want to take a look, because the questionnaire is on the internet. The food craving questionnaire and the mood type questionnaire. Of course, they're in the books as well, the mood cure and the craving cure. And you can go to juliarosscures.com and see the whole thing. So some people like to look at the questionnaires while I'm talking, because well, for obvious reasons. So in the case of Sam, I couldn't give him the questionnaire to fill out. He wasn't up to that either, and he wasn't up to an oral questioning session. So I just went through all of the types, and I started with the first type 1, which is the low serotonin type that I keep talking about, and and sleepless is one of its symptoms. This is a part of the questionnaire that I did not give Sam, because at the time that he came in, we did not have access to either tryptophan or 5-HTP, and those are the only amino acids that serotonin can be made from. So we didn't really know anything about serotonin and what to do about it naturally at that time. It was just a year later that we got access to 5-HTP from Europe, where it had been used for quite a while. Tryptophan, the FDA did not release formally until 2005, and they had banned it, a voluntary ban. This was not legally binding, a voluntary ban after a Japanese company had made a bad batch and knowingly sent it to the United States. And 15 people died, and over 1,000 people got very, very uncomfortable symptoms, some of whom improved and some of whom did not. But the real key to the ban was that 2 years before the first SSRI had come out, Prozac came out, and it wasn't making any money. It wasn't making any money because tryptophan was the only nutrient known to psychiatry. But they loved it, and they recommended it for insomnia and for some mood problems, and they weren't interested in buying Prozac. They weren't interested in prescribing it. I know doctors from that time period who tell me about their conversations with the rep. And one of them told me that a few months after she had turned down Prozac, the rep came back and said, guess what? We've now got a really super low-dose Prozac that makes the tryptophan work better. And she was interested in that. But obviously they weren't making enough money on this paltry little group that was willing to try it. And the next thing we knew, this disreputable small Japanese company had sent this bad batch and later testified in court that they knew that it was contaminated when they sent it here. They met with the FDA and the meeting records are sealed. So we did not have this tool, but I'm going to tell you a story before we go on with Sam, because I may forget to come back. I want to tell you a story of a child, because I want to make the point here that everyone is suffering from this neurotransmitter deficiency now. You know, mood problems, cravings for food. It's everywhere, and so we get mothers who bring their children in, and we actually had a client who was had been a marijuana addict, got clean and sober with the 12 steps, heard about us, had celiac sprue, but couldn't get off of wheat, adored wheat, and sugar and so forth, and worked with us and got off of all of the above and was very happy and no longer had chronic stomach pain. But her daughter did, and she was only 11. But she was a big girl, and she was a very angry girl a lot of the time. She was depressed a lot of the time, and she had a major addiction to macaroni and cheese, which she knew gave her major stomach aches just like her mother got. But when her mother tried to suggest that she stop taking it, she cried. So for her, the macaroni and cheese was doing something important, you know, in her brain. However, she was getting progressively more angry, and her mother was starting to be afraid of her because she was getting big. So she asked me if she could come bring her daughter in, and she did. And they walked in and sat down, and I said to the little girl, your mother tells me that you're very angry with her. And she said, you know, I sure am. And she started to give me all the chapter and verse about what her mother was doing wrong. And when she was, you know, wound down a little bit, I said, you know, I do know your mother. I've known her for a number of months now, and I would say she is not perfect, but that probably she's not the reason that you're so angry. I said, I think the reason you're so angry is that you have a brain that's hungry, and it's sending you crazy signals because it's not getting what it needs. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to try a brain fuel with me. Just a little bit of powder. Because it'll get right into the part of the brain that needs it, and then we can find out very quickly. And she said yes. So I gave her a little bit of tryptophan, about probably a third of a capsule. To start with, I ended up with almost a whole capsule with her to get an effect. And about 5 minutes later, she got up from her chair and went over to her mother and sat on her lap, which was in itself a great advance. But she whispered something in her ear, and her mother nodded. She stood up, and she sang a song. She sang, "You are so beautiful in every way, no matter what they say." I still cry when I think about that, and her mother cried, and the people in the front office cried. it turned out that she was a singer. She was singing in choirs and soloing, and she had a powerful voice. But she had not been in the mood to sing a loving song like that for quite some time. So Mommy took her home, and then we did follow-up on the phone. And so Mom called in a week later and said, you know what? We've got an appointment for next week, but we don't need to come. I'm just giving her that same amount of the tryptophan that you gave her in the office, and she's still happy. But here's the kicker. I asked her whether she'd be willing to try going off of macaroni and cheese. And she said yes. So then I got a call 10 days after that saying that she was still off of macaroni and cheese and that she was not getting these terrible tummy aches, and she was happy without it, and she was not having tantrums, and so this is a very nice example of a low serotonin sufferer who got the nutrient, the brain-targeted nutrient that she needed, and had an immediate improvement and a sustained improvement. And then after 3 months, she didn't need it at all anymore. This is what we found with children, is that they're fine with low dose. They need low dose under 13, and they don't need very long. And how do we know? If they've been happy for a couple of weeks, we stop giving them the amino and see how they do. And if their symptoms come back, they need it a little bit longer. But most children don't need it for more than 3 months. Whereas adults, more extensive damage, less able, the tissue is less eager to heal itself, and they typically are 6 months on the amino acids, up to a year. The only people who need the amino acid, and typically the doses are going down, they don't need as much over time. The only people who seem to need the amino acids more than a year are people with pretty intense addiction in their family. So there's definitely a genetic component. They've got, alcoholism on the father's side and food addiction on the mother's side. But typically there's substance addiction involved in the family. And so this is cautionary in one sense. Okay, they have worse damage because their brain was vulnerable to begin with. It wasn't that robust in making all these wonderful neurotransmitters to begin with. But what we also know from it is that these nutrients correct genetic expression. If they're in the brain long enough, the brain begins to adapt to them and program optimal amounts be converted naturally from food, which it wasn't doing before. So we love this stuff. So enough on type 1, the depressed, anxious, and sleepless craver. Just a little fun research that 5-HTP, in a comparison study with Prozac, 5-HTP raised serotonin levels 540%, Prozac raised serotonin levels 200%. 5-HTP outperformed Luvox, not dramatically, but on the other hand, of course, they used low doses. So, and finally, the sexual side effects of 5-HTP and tryptophan are nil, and on SSRI is 50 to 75% of SSRI takers are, really in trouble in terms of their drive and performance sexually. For that reason, we have lots of people who come to us who want to get off of antidepressants, and I'm not going to talk about that in detail today, but there's a whole chapter on it in my book, The Mood Cure. And by the way, the Craving Cure and the Mood Cure are both available at the closest bookstall now. I brought them down. But the taper off of SSRIs is very easy. We almost never see a withdrawal symptom. The only exception are drugs that leave the brain very, very quickly. So Paxil is one of them. Effexor, which is actually an SNRI, is another. People who take Effexor say that if they don't take it exactly 24 hours after the dose the prior day, they start crying. It's out of the system so fast and causing withdrawal symptoms that they had never had before. So in those cases, we often have to do something called the Prozac bridge, which Prozac takes quite a while to get out of the system. It's not one of these quick withdrawal drugs. So the doctors will typically prescribe Prozac for a week and then off the Prozac, along with the SSRIs. You can take, we can typically use the amino acids while they're on the antidepressants so that they know whether they're going to work. And then the doctor gives them a taper down or a Prozac bridge, and the drugs are out of the way, but they've been taking the 5-HTP or tryptophan at the same time so that they suffered no withdrawal symptoms and actually are feeling much, much better than they were feeling on the drug alone. And when the drug is finally withdrawn, they typically need to raise their amino acids just a little bit to stay at that really good emotional place. And at the moment, I think there have been one or two people for whom it wasn't a success. They needed some medication as well, but it was so long ago and it's so rare that I can't even remember it. So this is something we do all the time. It's very easy, and it's very clearly outlined in the book how to do it too, in case any of you have reason to do that. So now we're on to the second type of craver, very common, the hypoglycemic craver, who, for whatever reason, sometimes they're born with a very peculiar blood sugar regulation problem and their blood sugar crashes for no apparent reason, even after a meal, and they crave sugar. Or more commonly, of course, they're eating sugar and their blood sugar is spiking, and then the insulin comes in and sweeps it out of the bloodstream, but then there's nothing left in the bloodstream at all. And so they go into a hypoglycemic reaction, and then they want more sugar. So they're in the hypoglycemic reaction, but if they take the amino acid glutamine, which instantly converts into glucose, tastes very nice, and completely eliminates the cravings and typically the other symptoms of hypoglycemia as well. So the headaches, the stressed feeling, that unfocused, misspelled, weak, the craving for sugar and alcohol. By the way, there's a huge correlation between alcohol craving and blood sugar levels. So glutamine was actually first used by the scientist who discovered this amino acid. And he discovered how successful it was at leveling blood sugar and used it with alcoholics himself and wrote a book about it. Roger Williams was his name. The mineral chromium is also almost always depleted in big sugar consumers and diabetics. Diabetics have a fabulous response to glutamine. I'll tell you a diabetes story. I did a workshop, and there were 10 people attending, and we had everyone do the questionnaire. They turned in their questionnaires, and I had the amino acids there, and they did little trials. And we assessed the effects and, had a nice time, and then they were going to go away for 2 or 3 days and then come back and report on what happened. One of the attendees came back after 3 days. She was a nurse. She was diabetic. She never had glucose levels under 200, which is 100 over the minimum. And the very first night, she took the glutamine. She did not crave sugar. She did not eat sugar. She did not eat refined flour. She had actually whatever was decent at the cafeteria at the hospital. And when she got off duty, she went and bought two bottles, one for herself, and she raced over to her son's, a 26-year-old who had exactly the same level of diabetes at 26 as she had at 52. And both of them immediately had blood sugar drops to 100. They had not seen blood sugar drops that low, maybe ever. She kept in touch with me. She would call in every couple of months and say, "We're still good," So because diabetes is such a scourge, it's so deadly, there's the death rate is very high with kidney failure and the 70% liver disease, and it goes on and on. So this is, literally a lifesaver for hypoglycemics and diabetics whose blood sugar is all over the place. So now let's go back to Sam. When Sam got to the part of the questionnaire on the big chart that talked about craving comfort, being in emotional pain or physical pain, he wasn't in physical pain, about crying, tearing up easily, he pointed at that one. When we got to that one, he pointed. And then he had to go to the bathroom. And while he was gone, his counselor said that he was living in a trailer on the property of his mother, whose current husband, his stepfather, was in prison. His birth father was in prison. They were all alcoholic, lovely people, except when they drank, became violent. And anyway, he was in a lot of pain because of his family. And when he came back in, I told him that they had shared this, and that my suspicion was that he was using partly to comfort himself. He was drawn to alcohol and drugs. And that I'd like him to try an amino acid. Well, it turned out he'd been a bodybuilder, and they use amino acids all the time in mixes and whatever, powders, and he was fine with that. And so he took, there are two amino acids that will almost instantly relieve the craving for comfort. That for these people, sometimes they'll say that their favorite food or drink or whatever is their best friend. They really have a need for comfort, emotional comfort. They feel lonely for no reason, because their endorphin levels are low. So the two choices are D-phenylalanine is an amino acid that prevents the degradation of endorphin. So the brain is always making endorphin and it's destroying endorphin. It may not do it at the right rhythm. Maybe it's destroying a lot more than it's making. And we know it's not making very much because whoever it is isn't eating much protein. But it's been researched in medical centers for physical pain. That's where it was first researched and found to be really effective, allowing the MDs to lower the doses of morphine so that the constipation and the psychosis and whatever else side effects were minimized or eliminated altogether. What the pharmacology professor who instituted this practice at Chicago Medical School didn't know until I called him years later, was that D-phenylalanine was just as effective or more effective for emotional pain as for physical pain. He laughed at me when I said that. Oh, come on. I hate to say it, but, a typical medical response. And then I got a call from him a week later, and he said, "You know what? I told my wife what you said." And she said, "You dummy." She said, "Get that patent out right now and add this." So we have had wonderful success using it with people with physical pain, but the run-of-the-mill client is using it because they just can't stay away from comfort foods that are killing them. So we gave him DL-phenylalanine, though. D-phenylalanine has no effect on energy. It just gives that high endorphin feeling of pleasure in your own body and comfort. The DL combines the two forms. The amino acids can come in a D and an L form, and this DL combination is somewhat energizing. And one of his complaints was fatigue. So we thought, well, let's try this because it'll get to the stimulating part of his brain, which we haven't gotten to on the PowerPoint, and it'll get to this low endorphin situation in his brain. And so we gave it to him, and we waited. And while we were waiting, we did some other investigations. Well, let's see. I guess I don't want to get ahead of myself. We waited until my associate, who was also Native American, dug me in the ribs with her elbow and said, "Something's different about him." And so I asked him, are you noticing anything from the DL-phenylalanine? And he said, "I feel just right." He said something. It was only 4 words, but and of course we were flabbergasted because he'd only had 1 capsule. But this was something that we learned through him and through other Native Americans that we subsequently worked with, is that they have what they call the thrifty gene. They call it the thrifty gene. And what it means is that whatever substance they take in, because they're hunter-gatherers, they've got the original appetite and digestive chemistry. Whatever they take in, they consume every molecule of it. There's nothing wasted. So if they take in a toxin like alcohol for them, it makes them crazy. They can't handle it. It has a huge impact that it doesn't have on European Americans so much. And we've noticed that with every Native American we've worked with, they only need 1 capsule typically. Very, very sensitive reactors. So we kept going, but we'll come back to him. I just wanted you to know that chocolate is, the endorphin queen. This is the part of the brain that chocolate really, really is so famous for enhancing. So all of the substances here affect the endorphins directly. So the part of the brain that produces the endorphins are natural painkiller. The drugs are going to that area and they're cranking it up so that the pleasure that we would normally feel a moderate amount of in response to a healthy meal is bliss. And we want to go back to the drug bliss rather than, and we don't really have the capacity to have the pleasure after we've been using these substances for a while from ordinary food. So sugar, fat, gluten, casein, we talked about that, THC, alcohol, the internet. I don't know if you're surprised by that, but I was. I didn't know what part of the brain does the internet work on. What is it that we like so much? So we'll talk about that in a little bit, because none of the people I'm telling you about were on the internet. And of course, heroin and OxyContin and Suboxone, those are specific painkillers that only work, or primarily work in that pain-killing part of the brain. So when we're working with someone who has a drug addiction, we want to give them the things. We know that it's terribly uncomfortable to withdraw from opiate drugs. They're famous for having a relatively brief, less than a week, but very, very severe. You just want to die. So we give them all the things that are known in the recovery nutrition field to assist. For example, vitamin C to bowel powder to bowel tolerance is something that's actually been researched by itself to relieve the discomfort of opiate addiction. Not all of it, but it takes a bite out of it. So when we add that to the D-phenylalanine, of course, that's the major ingredient. Get those endorphins up as soon as possible. GABA, we're not at GABA yet, but that's our natural tranquilizer, and they need that in that first few days because there's so much tension and agitation. And they usually need high doses too, but only for that week, and then they may need it, but at lower doses or not at all. And then there's something here that I'm going to talk to you about a lot at the end of the day when I talk about the things that are magic for sleep and stress tolerance. There's a form of serine. Serine is another amino acid. There's a form of it, the phosphorylated form, not the phosphatidyl form, which is very easy to find in health food stores and so forth. The phosphorylated form is very, very calming. It specifically drops the levels of cortisol, which is primary beyond adrenaline in terms of a stress chemical. And withdrawal is very stressful. And so levels of cortisol just reach to the ceiling, and this is a substance that will help them tolerate that discomfort for that period of time. We also give them a mix of amino acids, of all amino acids, because some of the nutritional pioneers in the 1970s with addiction were working with nutrients in withdrawal and studying heroin addicts specifically and other opiate addicts specifically, and what they found was, on analysis, amino acid panel, a blood panel of amino acids, they had hardly any amino acids. And of course they weren't eating well, but that didn't account for it. The same procedure has been repeated in 2014, and it was so marked that they're now calling opiate addiction kwashiorkor syndrome. That's amino malnutrition. That's protein malnutrition, very frank. So we've got to get the aminos in them, but they can't eat during that first week. And they haven't been eating well for a long time. They can't eat. On heroin, a lot of people try and lose weight on heroin, right? Because they can't eat. Who needs food? Ordinarily, we're looking forward to food, but not when you're already pleasured by an opiate. So there are very good, complete blends that are well balanced. And my favorite is called Total Amino Solutions, which is readily available. So we give that orally, but whenever possible, we get them to somebody who can give them IV vitamin C and IV amino acids. Because you can get a bag of all the amino acids. They use it for post-surgery to keep people from losing all of their amino acid stores, which is very common post-surgically. A lot of people will lose their muscle mass overnight, practically. So for the first week, it can be wonderful to have IVs. There's actually a program fairly near here in Winchester, Virginia, Paul Frank's hometown. He doesn't even know about it. That it's called Bridging the Gaps, and it does nutritional, dietary therapy. Not very, nothing sophisticated, but wholesome food. and they do a lot of amino acid therapy. And they have now an IV clinic that the residents go to every day for the first week or so. And the difference, they don't experience the same kind of discomfort. They can tolerate giving it up. Initially, most of their clients had already been in other programs, and when they had this experience with the amino acid IVs, they said, we already learned all this other stuff in the other programs. This is what we needed. Thank you very much. And they left. So now the program spreads the IVs through the first 4 months so they don't lose, their clients. Don't tell them I said that. And then, of course, as soon as they possibly can, we get them on high-protein foods. There's one other thing that has made a difference, and that is a cranioelectric stimulation unit. They make them in two styles. There's one focuses on serotonin and one focuses on the endorphins. So for opiate addicts, you want, if you're going to use this to try and augment the amino acid therapy, you want to get one that focuses on the stimulation, goes towards the endorphin system. And that can really help too. Okay, now here's the fourth type of craver. A lot of people overeat when they're stressed, or eat food that they don't need or really want to be eating because of stress. But 30% of stressed eaters don't do that. They don't want to eat. They're too stressed to eat. They're not sleeping. They're not eating. They're that early stage of stress, If anybody's ever experienced it, food's the last thing that you think about. But 70% of stressed eaters are eating because of stress. So the overeating with stress motivators is big. And it's usually a sign that GABA levels are low, so our natural tranquilizer, which makes us able to be quiet. A lot of people can't pray or meditate because, so there's a spiritual price that they're paying for the fact that they're depleted in their natural ability to be silent and to relax. GABA neutralizes adrenaline. So the blood pressure comes down, the muscle tension is relieved. And when we came to this part of the questionnaire on the big board, Sam pointed to this one too. So in some way, he felt fine, but in another way, he realized that he still needed some help. So we gave him some GABA. With GABA, you start low with everybody. It's a little more potent at lower doses than some of the other aminos. So we started him at 100 milligrams. And I think we might have given him 2. And we saw the difference because he was sitting like this in the chair the whole time up until we gave him the GABA. And then he stretched his legs out in front of him, and crossed his ankles and kind of sat back. And we see this all the time, the posture totally changing right in front of us when we trial people on GABA. It's a very lovely gift to someone who is depleted to give them some GABA. Occasionally, GABA itself is an amino acid as well as a neurotransmitter, and it's usually very effective. 100, 200 milligrams. Occasionally, somebody needs 500. It's very unusual for people to need more, maybe a few times a day. But if it doesn't work, we have found that the amino acid only found in tea, L-theanine, does exactly the same thing. So it enhances the brain's utilization of GABA. And so we use it, as a default if the GABA doesn't work. So we after two little tablets, we asked him, did he want more GABA? And he said, nope. I already told you about that. So now we're on the fifth neurotransmitter that is depleted, and the symptoms of the depletion of dopamine or norepinephrine, which are naturally arousing, stimulating, makes us outgoing instead of shy. It's just lovely, and it also helps us with focus. So somebody who has attention problems usually needs this. And interestingly enough, they also need the GABA. They say that the GABA acts like a spam blocker to their brain. So it silences the brain chatter. But they also need this stimulating capacity because it specifically allows them to focus. But there are a lot of people who come to us who don't have, ADD, and they just are addicted to caffeine, or sometimes methamphetamine, or Adderall, or they're eating sugar for energy. A lot of times they'll have like Kit Kats or something right on the desk, and it's pure sugar. They're not interested in chocolate or any fancy stuff. Those particular people get the energy high, and they can get their job done and keep going in spite of fatigue with sugar. He was very tired. So when we got to this, finally, this was the other thing that he pointed to. And, I said, are you pretty tired most of the time? And he just nodded. And so we gave him some tyrosine, which is the more potent of the two options. There are two amino acids that can convert into this stimulating family of neurotransmitters. Tyrosine has more immediate potency. Phenylalanine is a little more gentle, so we'd use that with children. We'd use the phenylalanine with anybody who is sensitive. So if you're working with people, and one of the questions is, have you ever had an adverse reaction to a supplement? How many people in here have had an adverse reaction to a supplement? Adverse, yeah, negative reaction to a supplement. So there are about 10 people. How many people have had a negative reaction to more than one supplement? Okay, 2 people. So it's unusual. But if you happen to be an adverse reactor to supplements in general, unfortunately, amino acids often will cause something. And we don't know what it is. Is it the liver? We've never been able to figure it out. But when people call us, we say, first question is, are you sensitive to supplements oftentimes? There's something about the manufacture of supplements, because amino acids are very different from vitamins, but, you could have the reaction to both. This is one of the very few contraindications, but there are some. For example, Sam didn't have any problem with high blood pressure. He'd never had melanoma. He didn't have migraines. But if you have any of those three, then you may not want to use either one of these amino acids because they may exacerbate your tendency. It's another good thing about melanoma, high blood pressure, headache, migraine. One of the other things that you'll find in the books is some guidelines like that. Are there any amino acids that a particular person should be a little cautious about or, avoid altogether? You want to know that. I'm not telling you that, this is perfect for everybody, and, no. But by knowing ahead of time what the possible precautions would be, you don't have a problem, and the people you're working with don't have a problem either. And about half the time, at least probably more than half the time, what people notice is if they start at a very low dose and go up, they find out whether, they don't do that if they've had melanoma. They don't try it at all. Because tyrosine is the precursor to melanin in the skin. So there's some things you just don't try at all. If they have dangerously high blood pressure, you don't do it. We had a couple come in. She was a great big Swede, and he was a little Native American. And they read my book, The Mood Cure, and they decided they were both really tired and caffeine dependent and burnt out, and that they needed tyrosine. And so they took 4 capsules right off the bat, and they took those 3 times a day. And she found it perfect. And he got high blood pressure. Turned out he had a borderline high blood pressure situation, and it went up. So he quit altogether, went back to fatigue, and she's glowing, with energy and so forth. So then they decided, let's go out to the clinic and talk to her. Maybe we just screwed up something, missed something in the book. So they came in, and we said, well, how about 1 capsule of tyrosine? And we told them about starting low and only going up if you need to. So he was Native American, right? So he was very sensitive. It only took 1 capsule. His blood pressure was fine. He had energy. He was happy. And what happened to Sam when we gave him the tyrosine was that, first of all, he had very beautiful, lustrous black eyes, but they were focused on the floor, except for the times where he was looking at the chart. So he lifted his eyes, and he started tracking. He started, following the conversations other people were having. Then he got up and walked around, clearly energized. So I asked him, how are you doing? Would you like any more of this? Because now we're out of aminos, this is it. And he said, nope, just right. Just right. And for 8 months, he had no problems with relapse. He wasn't eating junk food, and he wasn't he wasn't drinking. And then he had a 3-day relapse. This is unheard of on the reservation. You're just always using. So for somebody to have a relapse and then come back out of it was unheard of. So the word got around, and I was hearing from other tribes, on the West Coast too, and we had this same experience, very similar to. Nobody else was unable to talk, though. And it turned out that on his best day, Sam was not a talker. But on his worst day, he was mute. So these are the stimulating things that hit this part of the brain. The energizing part of the brain will get cranked up and blissed out on, Starbucks and Coke. And chocolate has a stimulating effect as well as a pleasure-promoting effect. It's one of those magic drugs, why it's the food of the gods, because it hits so many different areas of the brain at once. Something we have noticed, it may never interest you, but we have noticed that some opiate addicts, some pot addicts, some alcoholics use for energy. And when you ask them, when they come in and you say, well, what are you like when you're off? What is it that you don't like about being drug-free? And they say, I get so tired, and these things give me energy. So for this type of an opiate addict, you'd want to give them both the endorphin-boosting D-phenylalanine and our friend tyrosine, so that they don't miss the drug. Whoops, wait a second. We are just about to get to lunch, but, and I've already talked about this. Whoops. So how soon do they start wanting healthy food? typically within 24 hours. What's typical for us is in the days when we were asking people to call us after they'd met with us to tell us how they were doing in the first week, we'd ask for a call every day. Just let us know. So we could offer them some support. And we were learning. And they would call us after 24 hours and they would say the same thing over and over and over. It's amazing. They didn't crave. They had been to the store. I remember one woman said, and I went down the bakery aisle. And I didn't want anything. So it's quick, but they get the message right away. And I hope you come back to the next installment of this talk, which is called "The Buddha Was Not a Vegan." How many of you knew, right? Because I talk about the animal protein vegan thing, and who else could I talk to but you, who would? I mean, I get so much abuse when I bring up the topic, right? So, of course, the animal protein, the good fats, and whatever whole carbs are needed. Whoops, I'm not going to go into that now. Okay, we're going to talk about dietary trends next, not in this presentation, but basically we help people define what traditional diet is. We have people, from all over the world in California, and so our Chinese clients find out what their people ate. It's not that far back for them to identify it. So we're real about it. What is your tradition? Do you know anything about it? Let's have you eat that. And if not, then Weston A. Price. So I'm going to talk a lot about this. What does omnivorous mean? Michael Pollan did us a big disservice when he said the omnivore's dilemma, right? Because it makes it sound like we have a choice. Oh, we could eat plants or animals. The definition of omnivore is that you need both. Keep that firmly in mind. No other diets have 2 million years of proven benefit. And I think that's it. Great. We're in time for lunch. Hope to see you later.